Hello, everyone. It's Charlene Lee, and today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is failure. Now, this is not the idea that we are going out and seeking failure, but instead, how do we deal with failure, especially when it comes to using and designing generative AI products and services? Now, today I'm going to get a little bit more into the weeds than I normally do because I had lunch recently, and one of the people I met was talking about how they were looking at AI and, in particular, designing it so that it would fail gracefully. And I was really taken by this idea because instead of trying to make his product or service as perfect as possible to meet every single possible user journey and persona experience that's out there, he said, basically, we know it's going to not work. And how do we anticipate those points and how do we fail gracefully in a way that is as human as possible when you're using an AI tool? So, today I want to talk about how to think about that because it's not something we normally build into the way we think about products and services or even how we interact with each other. Is how are we going to anticipate where we fail? And I wanted to take this idea and extend it from not only generative AI, but into our roles as leaders, leading these disruptive operations and activities. So let's get started. So the way I think about failure is that instead of thinking as something to avoid, is to think of it as something that's inevitable and something to anticipate and even welcome. Because you don't learn unless you make mistakes and you fail. So learning doesn't happen unless mistakes happen, unless there are errors, because you're doing everything perfectly otherwise. And we know that things don't happen perfectly. So if you look for those failure points, you anticipate them, you even look forward to them as ways to improve, to make things better, to make things, to recover from things that didn't work. And this is particularly an issue with AI and generative AI in particular, because AI as a tool, the way it's designed, it is designed to be probabilistic, meaning it's probably going to be this answer. It's more likely to be this answer than that answer. And so it's making a guess. And sometimes, very often, the AI guesses correctly that these are the images that you're looking for, that these are the string of words, but it's not always. And we know that it may fall short or completely fail at whatever task you're giving it to do. So the key here is not to try to avoid outright failure, but to find out what it is, to make it into part of that experience for that person, just like the rest of your product or service that you're designing. So it could be anything from a customer service experience to an actual product or service, or it could be something that you're using internally to get work done. But whatever it is, you may actually have to design. You're going to have to design for the fact that it is not going to meet the expectations of that user. So some of the really interesting work right now is redesigning the way that these pathways are actually happening. So I wanted to start out the conversation today. If you are in the audience, share where you're coming from. We'd love to welcome you, but also share how you are thinking about how to handle failure gracefully, either in the way you're using these generative AI tools, but also in the ways that you're thinking about doing it as a leader. So, one of the most interesting things that I found in the research is that when an AI system fails or when we fail, we want to experience that in the most humane and humble way possible. And I think it's so important to uh, disclose and admit that a mistake has been made. And this is often the hardest thing to do is to acknowledge that a failure has happened. And as leaders, as people, we can also find that to be very difficult. So one of the things here to do is to when I've made a mistake as a leader to like, wow, I so sorry, I didn't realize I'd done that. I'm sorry for the experience and accept it and admit it. And then to approach it with as much humanity and humility as possible. And we do that as people, we can also impart that into the machines, into the systems that we create. And it's really inviting, it's explaining, first of all, what happened, understanding what the limitations of our systems and of ourselves, and then inviting people to continue forward in the task, to continue working with you. And so, again, that applies to people and it also applies to the machines. So, I want to just talk a little bit about some of the unique things about artificial intelligence that raises up. And again, I just find it the parallel so interesting in how the machines do these things and we as humans do them too. So, first of all, there could be user errors in the system. In other words, the person doesn't know how to use the system. I don't know about you, but when I look at Midjourney and I see the prompts that people are creating, I have no idea what people are talking about apertures and contrasts. I just usually use straight out words. I don't know any of the actual mechanics of how to manipulate images. And so I'm not able to use it as well as some other people. So that's a user error. But there will always be system errors in that the system's not flexible enough to understand and to meet the user needs. So, does the system at Midjourney understand what I'm trying to do, even though I may be using layperson's uh, language rather than a sophisticated professional's language? But then, what I find interesting today is the context errors, in that the tools may not understand the context in which you are in. So, I may be looking at something from one perspective as an analyst, and actually, the machine is looking at it from, again, a general journalistic or general information perspective. And so we know that from prompt engineering best practices today, that being able to set the context for the AI to say, you are an analyst, you are of a certain level of education, you have a certain background, you live in a certain geographic area. So it understands the perspective that you are trying to take. Those context errors, unless they are there and explicitly given to somebody, to the machine, may not be understood. The parallel of this to leadership is that you may not actually understand the context of a person's situation, of what they're bringing into the room, their experience levels. So when we have these context errors, it's to pause and say, wait a minute, what are we not understanding about each other's perspective? Making sure we're clarifying that context and then being able to move forward. I find this is extremely hard to do because the system is working as needed. The user's putting in their inputs, but somehow it's not connecting. And so the person using it or interacting with you as a leader is perceiving that they're not seen and understood. So this is a particular problem, I think, when we're trying to design these systems. So I just see Tara coming in from Los Angeles. Thank you so much for joining, Tara. Again, if you're joining in today live, I encourage you to just type in where you're coming from and also how you're thinking about failure when it comes to these AI systems, but also how it reflects back on you as a leader thinking about failure. So, the reason I want to talk about this today is that our knee-jerk reaction. I put this into the copy for the session today. Is that we all want things to be perfect as leaders, as people who are trying to do the right thing with our jobs. Looking at these generative AI tools, for example, we want them to work perfectly. And the reality is, they just do not. They just do not work perfectly. So, how do we think about failing, anticipating that failure, and failing gracefully? And the reason why I think that's so important is that if we set the expectations for ourselves that we are not going to be perfect, again, in our AI systems and also as leaders, then we give ourselves that room, that grace, that understanding to be able to stay in connection and to continue on so that we're encouraging more interaction so that we can fix that failure and move forward. So just want to say hi to Beatrix from Miami. Thank you so much for joining. And Vince also from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So again, thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions, again, please feel free to share where you're coming from, but also would love to hear from you. How do you think about failure, especially in the context of your leadership, but especially in the context of this crazy new space called generative AI? The thing I hear from leaders over and over again is this one question: is it too early? Is it too early for us to get in? We don't want to get burned. We don't want to make big mistakes. We're concerned that it's just maybe too early to get in and to start doing things. And you won't know if it's too early unless you start at least experimenting with some of the biggest areas that you think could impact your business. And I talked about this in my live stream and my newsletter last week on LinkedIn about how you can put a plan together in 90 days or even less to figure out what you want to do with generative AI. And it starts with your strategy. So when it comes to creating a strategy, when it comes to creating the use cases and the applications, how to use generative AI, there's this desire again to make everything perfect. But I strongly believe you can't set that expectation. It's not like a normal strategy because it's constantly changing. The ways that you will learn how to use these tools will keep expanding as the technology advances. But that doesn't mean that you should wait for this to be completely figured out for you to begin working on it. And so one of the examples I'd love to give is you may decide that you have all of this unique data inside the company, all this unique customer data. And instead of using the public version of these generative tools like ChatGPT, you want to bring in your own private large learning model, your own private GPT to use against your data. And that may be too early to do right now because the technology just isn't as easy as it is. But there are some early tools. I've built my own GPT. I call it Char GPT, and I'm experimenting with it. It doesn't mean that it's prime time that I'm going to give out to people to try and use. It's almost there. But I'm experimenting with it to see what it can do and what it can't do, understand its limits, understand where it's failing. And so experimenting with that now is absolutely crucial for you to discover and figure out as the technology evolves what can work. And this whole idea of embracing the inevitable failure is something that we may not feel that comfortable with. And especially with these new tools, how it reflects on us as leaders, this is again a very important skill set to develop inside of you as a leader and inside of your organization. So I want to go in and Natalie, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I think you were on the stream last week. The 90-day plan is great. Please take a look at that. You can find it on my feeds and LinkedIn. But again, it's one of the tools I just putting out there and seeing if it's resonating with people. And it sounds like it's resonating with you, Natalie. So thank you for that feedback. So I want to go in and give a quick example. I don't know if you've been using these systems. I sometimes use them as voice prompts and chats. And when something doesn't work, I usually get something like, and I just read some of the prompts I've been collecting. I didn't get that. Can you say it again? I mean, how many times have you heard that when you call into your bank or to the airline, into my cable system, my internet systems? They also sometimes say, "I missed what you said. What was that?" Or, "Sorry, could you say that again?" And I put up with that to some point. But I think one of the issues is that if what you're saying doesn't match what's in their response database, it comes up as a negative response, a no response, basically. So it gives you those default things. With generative AI, it can start thinking about some generative fallback responses, is what it's called. And so it can generate AI for what a virtual agent would say. So, some of the things are what would you expect that somebody is saying, and how would you give responses to that in a different way? So, the AI may have heard part of the response, like you gave a zip code, but it had too many digits in it. You go, "Well, I heard you say this, but it was too many digits. Can you please say again with 5 numbers in your zip code, for example? Or the phone number wasn't long enough. Did you have an area code to go with that? This is what I heard." So it's a much more human response to hear and say, "This is what I see, but I didn't get all of it. But I did hear part of it, or I didn't hear any of it all." Or if it has some information, how would you respond as a human? And the beautiful thing about generative AI now is that it can do a lot of that heavy lifting without you having to say so and feel in a very graceful way. So that's something I'm particularly interested in. And in particular, how does it create opportunities for feedback? This is what you said, correct? Did I get that right? Because I'm not sure. Again, if that probabilistic AI isn't sure, it'll tell you that it's not sure. And in the worst case scenarios, you want to give that user an out to return it back to a human. or to shift from a automated virtual situation to a manual human person, putting that human back in the loop. So you're giving people options of what to do next. Again, one of the worst things I've ever had happen is like, well, I don't understand you. Call back later when you know what you want, and just hung up on me. You don't want, that's not a good response to a failure. And again, knowing whether it's a user failure, a system failure, or a context failure is really helpful to understand. And I want to apply this to our leadership concept too, as well. So when something isn't working, are we checking in and asking people, did I get this right? Do we even ask for that? I was talking with a leader, and he recently was sharing how frustrated he was because he would, in one-on-one sessions, would give feedback to somebody. And it's like, hey, if you have any feedback for me, please let me know. And they never gave him any feedback. And I was talking about it afterwards with him, and he's like, and I go, that should have been a tip off, that you're giving them all this feedback, but none of it's coming back, even when you requested it. So how do you know whether you're failing or you're not? How will you, were you succeeding or not? So creating feedback loops, engineering them into the systems that you're building with generative AI, but also engineering them into your leadership practices is so important. So this is why I find it so interesting to be thinking about leadership and also how we can learn from the generative AI and exchange these two areas, because both require a very humanistic approach to thinking about how we deal with failure. So I have a couple comments here. Kate, hey, Kate, to see you, Kate. Love to see you here. So from San Francisco, just right down the street, admitting failure is a sign of strength and courage. That's a great point, Kate, because it does take a lot of courage, and courage and strength to admit that things aren't working right. That very explicitly, this is where I failed, and this is how I plan to improve. So that's a great point of feedback. It takes a lot of guts to do this. Um, let's see. We have Beatrix asking, is there a body or agency that regulates AI use today? A great question, Beatrix. There isn't. There is the EU, the European Union, has put in place something called the AI Act. It has various provisions about escalating levels of risk. So if you are using AI to make more risky or impactful or consequential decisions, like giving advice to somebody, making a health diagnosis, or hiring somebody, then you have to take safeguards to make sure that it isn't biased, that you're using the data correctly, et cetera. And there are just some things that it just shouldn't be used for. But if you're using it to filter out spam email, there's a different set of regulations that are pretty minimal. So, but that's only in the European Union. There are some bodies like California that have put in place some data privacy rules about when data can and cannot be used to train AI, or how it's going to be used, and how transparent you have to be about how data is used. But as you know, in the United States, we're not very good at having federal level regulations versus state based or even voluntary things. So, no regulatory here in the US right now. And in China, there are a completely different set of rules. So basically, it's a bit of a mess. And then just going back to a little bit, oh, and we have one person saying this is all very intriguing, thinking, and lots of thumbs ups. All right, so I'm just going to go into the last part today of how do you actually feel gracefully. And again, I find this so interesting to have it, again, apply to our generative AI efforts, uh, but also to our leadership efforts too, as well. So I'm doing double duty today. The first thing is to conduct an error audit. Where do you anticipate things could go wrong? Again, I like to think, again, you can do a lot of user testing. You can do a lot of areas of anticipating with your generative AI systems, but anticipating and conducting an error audit and see where things have actually gone wrong. Similar to your leadership, what are the trends? What are the tendencies, the places where you repeatedly are making similar mistakes and not necessarily learning from them? Again, I like to think that mistakes and failures are okay, but you better not make them twice, or at least keep advancing and making different ones in the same category, but demonstrate that you're not making the same mistakes twice. And how would you know that if you weren't tracking and auditing what's happening. So I used to say that having a failure resume is a pretty darn good thing to have because you can go through and just look at all the things, similar to a success resume, all the things you've done, all the things you haven't done well, and what did you learn from them? And that learning is so important from both, again, a leadership perspective. What have you learned? What has gone wrong? How do you improve and make sure you don't make the same mistakes over again? And if you do, how do you fail gracefully? How do you anticipate that this error, this mistake, this failure could happen? And you let the people who are going to be interacting with you know that this is a tendency of mine. I may not be as clear. For example, I may not be as clear about what my expectations are. And if I'm not meeting and not being clear about those expectations, please let me know. And I'll take some time to consider how I can be more clear. So it's anticipating and letting people know these are the areas that I'm really good at, but these are other areas that I may not be as strong at. And if I'm falling down and not meeting your expectations, or there's something going on that I'm not understanding the context about, then please let me know. Similarly, with our generative AI systems, if we can anticipate where they are, we can put other safeguards around it, but we can also put in the systems to fail gracefully with those responses, to be able to say, this is something we're just not very good at and need a bit more information. How can we actually figure this out together? Then the second thing is to make sure that you have this quality assurance. This is the testing. This is the automated review process, making sure that you're going through and understanding all of the feedback over time and seeing where systems are working and they aren't working. Especially when it comes to AI, and especially when it comes to our leadership practices. This is not set and forget. You cannot just assume that it's working really well. So, what are the regular timings of the reviews we're going to have? Is it daily for something that's used all the time? Is it weekly, monthly, quarterly, whatever it is? Make sure that you have a routine, a regimen that you abide by to make sure you're checking to see what is your error, what is your mistake, what is your failure rate. And when it comes to your leadership, this is extremely important too as well. How are we understanding what's working, what's not, unless we actually check and audit? I believe in 360 reviews. 360 reviews meaning you're asking everyone across the board, maybe in an in-depth way once a year, to say like what's working, what's not. And when you can identify the things that are not working for you as a leader, then set yourself on a path to improve in that area. And the quick check ins are to ask people, these are the things I want to improve on. Am I getting better? And that could be the quick check in, but it's clear to everyone these are the places where I have a tendency to not perform as well as I'd like to, where I'm making mistakes, errors, and failing. And I'm trying to reduce my error rates in those areas. So, how am I doing in doing that? So, this quality assurance is such an important thing. And then finally, there is an area of keeping a human in the loop when it comes to AI. What is the human going to do to make sure and review the outputs on a regular basis to ensure there's accuracy, that there isn't bias, that there are no unidentified system errors that go unchecked? And this is where that ethical, responsible AI training is so desperately needed. We need people who are using these tools on a daily basis to be thinking, is this working? Is it not? How do I look at this as a user, as a designer, and understand whether there are any mistakes happening here? Because there are just some things that the human eye can only identify. And similarly, when it comes to leadership, how are we including other people in that feedback loop? Because we can't be trusted by ourselves to be able to identify. We need a mirror. We need a reflection back on what's working, what's not. So having that perspective, again, as a mentor, as a coach, as a leader, as a manager, who can also give you that feedback is extremely, extremely valuable. So that's what I have for today. I just want to see if there are any other questions. I don't see any, but if there are any, we have a few more minutes to do that. But I want to just share with you what I'm going to be talking about next week. And I'm excited to be joined by Katja Welsh. She is a longtime friend. and former colleague. We both worked at Forrester Research a long time ago. I'll just put it that. And she has gone on from Forrester being an analyst there to hold some very interesting positions as a chief data officer at places like Vodafone, where she was the global chief data officer for all the global operations. And she recently just left Levi Strauss as a chief strategy and data and AI officer, and is now currently the chief digital officer at Harvard Business School. And I'm also thrilled to share that she's also writing this generative AI book with me. And it's so refreshing to have somebody who has actually done this work calling me out and saying, that's not the way it works. This is the way it actually works. So it's super helpful to have her. And I invited her to come on and talk about a topic that she's very passionate about, which is re-engineering for a business strategy. So we're going to have a quick conversation next week. Just want to introduce her to the audience and just wanted to share her incredible depth of knowledge and experience with this audience as we go through and think about all the possibilities now that we can to think about our business strategy and how to engineer, when not to, as a matter could be. But thinking this is a very interesting time to be taking a look at our business strategy and how it's going to change. So that's what I have for today. I just want to check. Okay, I think all the questions and comments have been answered. Just want to wish you all the best in thinking about failure in a different way, how to fail, not avoid failure, but how to fail gracefully as a leader of your organization, doing audacious, exponential, disruptive change, but also how to think about your generative AI efforts and how they need to be designed to fail gracefully because it is inevitable that they will make mistakes, commit errors, and fail. So, hope you have a chance to embrace failure in the next week, and I will talk to you next Tuesday. Thanks.